Well, muy buenos días, bienvenidas todas y todos al Foro Diálogos Transatlánticos en la 9ª conferencia de CLACSO, del Consejo Latinoamericano de Ciencias Sociales, que tiene lugar en el día de hoy, en el eje en particular que es Epistemologías del Sur. Estamos muy felices de recibirles, estamos felices y honradas con la participación de grandes intelectuales provenientes de diferentes continentes, de África, de Asia, de América Latina, del Caribe, de otros países. Realmente es una geografía del sur, de un pensamiento emancipador, crítico, ¿verdad?, que estamos construyendo también desde la especialización en epistemologías del sur, que tengo el honor de que sea dirigida por el profesor Boaventura de Sousa Santos en CLACSO, junto con mi querida colega, compañera y gran intelectual, que es María Paula Meneses, que se encuentra aquí, a quienes le agradezco de corazón la participación. También decirles que este foro en particular tiene como organizaciones invitadas a ACS, o el Consejo Árabe de Ciencias Sociales, la profesora y presidenta de esa institución, que es Seteni Yami, que se encuentra aquí, a quien agradezco también de corazón. Se encuentra también la gran intelectual india que se encuentra ahora en Massachusetts, ¿verdad?, Hayati Ghosh, con quien mantuvimos a lo largo de tantos años el programa tricontinental Sur-Sur, junto con Ideas, que es la institución de la cual Hayati es su presidenta. Y también Alicia Girón, la doctora Alicia Girón, que es de aquí, que nos recibió con tanto amor y cariño, es una gran intelectual feminista, economista también, e integra también el grupo de feminismos y emancipaciones de CLACSO, y hace parte del PUE, ella preside el programa de estudios sobre África y Asia dentro de esta gran universidad, a quienes agradecemos. Realmente es una universidad tan generosa que nos alberga en todos estos días y estamos realmente muy, pero muy felices. También agradecemos la participación del grupo de trabajo de afrodescendencias y propuestas contrahegemónicas que coordina y lidera la gran querida afrofeminista cubana Rosa Campolegre Septién, que también es la rectora de la Universidad de la Diáspora Africana, que va a venir en breve. Lamentamos muchísimo que la otra gran institución con la cual formábamos parte del programa tricontinental Sur-Sur, Codes Ría, su dirección y su representante Godwin Murunga, no ha podido estar presente aquí. Le mandamos realmente un saludo y un abrazo fraterno. Este foro está pensado como una acción política que gira en torno de una crítica profunda al capitalismo, al colonialismo y al patriarcado entre África, Oriente y América Latina y Caribe. Guiarán los debates del foro los conceptos de sur que habitan las epistemologías de sur, de justicia entre saberes, de justicia racial, de economía feminista, también ligada a la justicia de los pueblos indígenas y pueblos afrodescendientes, y las luchas y resistencias de las mujeres, de las identidades oprimidas. Proponemos pensar las articulaciones políticas y poéticas de estas luchas que inspiran a los feminismos postcoloniales, descoloniales, afrofeministas, desde un concepto central que es el de Audre Lorde, que es la erótica, y también de Edward Glissant, la poética de la relación, un término también acuñado por Solí Carneiro sobre enregresar los feminismos, que va a tener lugar en la tarde. Nos interesa discutir y anhelamos que sea realmente un foro de discusión, y queremos agradecer fundamentalmente la posibilidad de pensarnos en este lugar, en un pensamiento emancipatorio y alternativo. En el día de hoy le agradezco a mi querida amiga, colega, gran feminista Marta Sierra de Kenyon College, argentina como yo, pero residente en Estados Unidos, que va a moderar junto conmigo la mesa, y a Michelle Yanagao Guimarães Costa, que va a moderar algunas de las mesas siguientes. En el panel 1, que es el que comienza ahora, se llama Perspectivas desde el Sur, un diálogo sobre capitalismo y colonialismo entre África, Asia, Oriente y América Latina y Caribe, y va a dar su inicio en su palabra el profesor Boaventura de Sousa Santos. Muchas gracias.
Buenos días a todas y a todos. Y también saludo a la mesa, mis colegas aquí. Y yo quisiera, son 10 minutos, muy rápido, porque quisiéramos que haya debate. Una primera nota es sobre el contexto internacional en que nos movemos hoy. Yo pienso que vamos a entrar en un proceso que podríamos llamar de desglobalización. Nosotros pensábamos que caminábamos para algo irreversible de globalización. Pensábamos que podríamos, desde 2001, cuando fundamos el Foro Social Mundial, que habría dos globalizaciones, una del capitalismo y otra de los movimientos sociales. Otro mundo es posible, era nuestro, y sigue siendo nuestro slogan. Nos parece que después que empezó la guerra de Ucrania, estamos en un proceso de desglobalización, donde esta guerra no es una guerra entre Rusia y Ucrania, tampoco es una guerra entre Rusia y la OTAN, tampoco es una guerra entre Rusia y Estados Unidos, es una guerra entre Estados Unidos y China. ¿Y qué pasa por ahora por Rusia? Para bloquear la expansión de China a través de su frontera norte, que es la frontera asiática, que es inmensa, miles y miles de kilómetros, para impedir la expansión de China para el occidente, que ya está en este momento bastante avanzada con todos los transportes de cargo por ferrocarril que ya se realiza desde de China hasta Bielorrusia. Entonces, la idea es que es necesario el imperio dominante, que es un imperio, el imperialismo norteamericano, declinante,
declining imperialist empire to defend itself against China. And the war is going to be against China. When we see what is being published, we realize that what is happening in the Ukraine might take place in Taiwan in a few years, for the same reason, to try to provoke China. That is my reading. So what does that mean for our context? When there is this reality between these two empires, I believe that Europe is going to be as a zone of influence of the United States. It doesn't have energy resources, and all the articulation with Russia was lost precisely for Germany to lose economic power and for Europe to be completely dependent on the United States. Latin America was a traditional area of influence, but the difference with Europe is that Europe doesn't have resources. Latin America has natural resources, but they have to be controlled by the United States. So we will go through a ferocious war for the control of natural resources in Latin America. Africa is a field of war between these two tendencies. Africa is being fought, and the United States has just passed a law that tries to control the actions of Russians in Africa. That is, the American embassy will surveil everything that Russians are doing in Africa to avoid a strong Russian influence. And this is happening in the United States Senate, because what they can do is that they can become an ally for the Chinese. And Asia, of course, we believe that Asia can have much more influence in the zone, and India is emerging as another power. that can give you the idea that we're going towards a new system of neutral countries. You must realize that the countries that have refused to instill sanctions against Russia amount to more than 70% of the world population. So most of the world population is against these sanctions because of the fear of damaging their own interests. So we're in the possibility of achieving a new neutrality, but it's going to be very hard, especially for Europe and Latin America, maybe easier in Africa and Asia. Why is this important for us? Well, this is important for us because we need to work on transatlantic dialogue that will, of course, have an influence on our work. Since 2017, in the Latin American continent, we have a partnership of universities, Sur, it's called. We started after the centennial of the Córdoba, Argentina manifest, in which Argentinian students rebelled against the university, looking for another university. So we have a much larger knowledge that has not moved forward a lot. We have a lot of contact with Africa and Asia, but we need to see how the fundamental laws for that contact will be. I'm going to mention this very briefly, what we need to do in terms of practice. First of all, universities in this space that want to be a space that resists this idea that the world is dominated by areas of influence and that there's no possibility to be autonomous and sovereign. Those of us who are in that fight, we need first of all to allow Southern universities to be a beacon against the fight against capitalism, colonialism, and the patriarchy. So we need to create strategies to know each other, to decolonize, and to get rid of the patriarchy in universities. These are tasks that are very different, that need to take place in Africa and Asia, and they have an epistemological nature, and that's why we have called these series of conversations Southern epistemologies, because they refer to being anti-capitalist and anti-patriarchy. The second idea that we will have to do is to create integrated programs for PhD and post-PhD. We're working with universities in Spain and Europe and India, integrated programs that could make these objectives a reality of achieving a university that is more committed with its resistance against capitalism, colonialism, and the patriarchy. Third, we need to protect our academics. This is a reality that is going to be harder and harder. Democracy is on the edge of chaos, and we have more and more academics under threat who are refugees. In my center in Portugal, we have a colleague from Colombia who is a refugee. She was threatened, someone tried to kill her, and luckily they weren't able to do that, and now she's with us. Another colleague from Brazil is going to arrive in our center as a refugee as well. She is in France at the moment, and the militia of Rio de Janeiro, she's leading them. She was threatened. She received death threats, and she had to leave the country. And there are many. A Turkish economist who is at the moment requesting asylum. So we will have to coin a system in universities and departments in public education centers with the possibility of financing the academics that are at the moment in this situation. So far, we have organizations like Scholars at Risk that do a little help, but we haven't done as much as we should. And finally, the last measure that I propose is very much concrete as well. These universities and these transatlantic dialogue require a real commitment with territorial, local, and global realities from each country. We will have to articulate ways to educate the populace. We have a great tradition of doing this in Latin America with Paulo Freire and others. And with this public education, we now have a way of proposing and circulate this in the continent and Africa and Mumbai, which is the reality of social movements. University. Go to their website and see what we do. What we basically do is 2-day workshops, 1/3 is scholars, 2/3 are social movements, and for 2 days in attendance and in residence, we discuss realities of territories, and you can't imagine the transformation, the ethic and epistemological transformation of the people that go to these workshops. In Morelia, for example, we have an agreement with the local university. So you have to demand the deans in universities the creation of these workshops. These are innovative things that we can do in this whole space. So these are my suggestions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. But everything that you mentioned is so valuable, and the proposals are so proactive, which are so necessary, such as the University of Social Movements. At the end of the forum, we're going to have time for questions and debate. So we're going to continue now with Alicia Giron, who I already introduced. Thank you, Alicia. Good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. It is such a pleasure to be here in this panel. I thank the invitation of Karina to participate in this forum. I applaud what Boaventura has mentioned in the end. I believe that these universities with new epistemologies are very important to understand precisely the crisis that social reproduction is undergoing. I am going to talk about the myths of economy. When I started my career in economics, I was taught that economics is the science that studies scarce resources, and that can't be farther from the truth. It's the science that studies the supply of life. Another assumption that all economists have, and this is very important because if we see all economic policies that central banks have followed in the past 3 decades of the global south and the northern countries, is that money falls from helicopters. And this idea from Milton Friedman has made many countries, even emerging countries, new democracies, to not be able to achieve what they would have liked to achieve in their campaigns. Money falling from helicopters is a false metaphor. Money is a creation of the state, and that is why we need to address another myth in economics. the central bank being the lender, the last instance lender. And central banks, what they have done is to save banks. Every time there's a bank crisis, the central bank saves banks, as it happened in the 2006-2007 crisis. The central bank saved banks that were too big to fail. And that is simply not true. This fallacy is being applied in countries around the world. The central bank creates jobs, it hires in the last instance. Something that is very important as well. I hear often, even in a discussion yesterday at the Crisis Forum for Economics in Latin America, together with the work group for China in the world map, we talk about the state as an abstract. The state is not an abstract. The state serves to help the interest of big corporations. And it's important to be aware of this when we're talking about this crisis that we are living through. I don't even know if it's a crisis or what is going on with this war. Behind it, there must be very big economic interests for natural resources. And as Professor Boaventura, this war between China and the U.S. for natural resources that we have in our countries, natural resources that are in the global south, and I mean, Japan, it's an island that doesn't have natural resources, and there are other countries in Europe that don't have these resources. So the state serves the interests of international corporations. Another thing that I think is fundamental, that we must be aware of it, is that the whole Bretton Woods monetary system that has two little legs or two big legs, which is the International Monetary Forum and the World Bank, is the one that has conducted the economic policy of all these countries. If you see the case of Mexico or any country in Latin America, we have answered to the financial interests. We have been indebted. We hire debt more and more, and we need to pay that debt under an austerity policy implemented as one of the principles of the Washington Consensus. I would now like to speak about something that, well, before 2007 we had growth rates. China reached two-figure growth rates. However, the economy, and we must be clear about this, economy is cyclical. It can't grow so much, and it's constantly breaking down. That is why when we talk about the end of capitalism, well, rather, capitalism has its crisis, but it's strengthened by them. And it sweeps big masses of people in these breaking crises. So the alternatives that came about, and it's important to mention this, the alternatives for central banks to recover the economy after 2008, after the Lehman Brothers crisis, were policies. We even talked about the return of Keynes because there were big investments by governments themselves. However, the whole policy served to continue reestablishing the gains of big corporations. And this policy, at least in Latin American countries, and I'm going to be speaking on their behalf, you can find this in data for the Latin American Commission. It was based on austerity laws to improve the tax deficit. Another myth is the best thing is to decrease the tax deficit. While tax deficit helps job creation, in this whole decade, 2009-2019, it was a decade to maintain our countries stable. Just as when a family member or a friend goes to intensive care and the doctor says he or she is stable. That is the stability that we've had for the past 10 years, from 2009 to 2019. Then COVID hit, and many have said that it was this black swan. But no, the crisis was already there. It's not that COVID gave us the crisis. The crisis was going to happen, and COVID was the only thing that triggered the fragility and financial stability crisis. And how did we face it? We were told that there was no money, no money, no money. And trillions of dollars have been thrown at this crisis. Instead of talking about billions of millions, we say trillions. Only the United States has injected $1.8 trillion into the economy, and the economy continues that way. The chief of the FMI, Gita, mentioned that the projections for 23 and 24, at least for emerging countries, is that we're going to continue not just in a low growth period, but that there are also no perspectives for growth. I would like to put on the table how there is a crisis in the reproduction of the population, because women are the most impacted. And this social crisis is taking us to a new recomposition of the capitalist system, and therefore to a deglobalization process, broken chains, broken value chains, and it'll be very difficult to achieve or to counteract what has happened. This war, I have followed on the press what the press wants me to follow. The press that I read is the Wall Street, the Financial Times, The Economist, El País, La Jornada from Mexico. But I would love to read Russian and read the other kinds of news so I would have a bigger perspective. That would be all, Karina. Such a pleasure now to introduce you to our next speaker, Hayati Ghosh. Muchísimas gracias. Qué placer y qué privilegio es volver a la conferencia de Claxo. Antes de la conferencia estábamos hablando de esto. Para las personas de otras regiones, tenemos tantos celos para esas personas porque tenemos tanta solidaridad regional y ustedes tienen una fuerza tan progresiva que para la gente en África y en Asia que estamos batallando, bueno, África está mejor, pero en Asia estamos batallando para conjuntar el tipo de solidaridad en ciencias sociales que tienen ustedes. Así que muchísimas gracias por dejarme ser parte de esto. Quisiera hablar un poquito sobre por qué el sur es todavía importante, por qué debemos de tener eventos que conjuntan a gente del sur. Es importante porque el imperialismo sigue siendo importante. Esta idea del norte y el sur y esta división, estas son cosas perjudiciales que se implementaron para confundirnos. La idea de que el crecimiento de China va a causar divisiones, etcétera. Lo que estamos viendo es imperialismo con algunos jugadores diferentes, algunos chicos en la cuadra. tenemos que definir primero qué es el imperialismo para mí, que es la batalla para el control sobre el territorio económico. Y el territorio económico cambia en su forma y en su importancia. Por supuesto, la tierra, el trabajo, la mano de obra, eso por supuesto son componentes del territorio económico, pero ahora estamos viendo otras maneras, otras formas de el territorio económico, el ciberespacio, de las vacunas, el control sobre el conocimiento y la propiedad intelectual. Esa es una nueva forma. O el control sobre lo que veíamos como necesidades básicas, controladas por el Estado, salud, electricidad, agua. Esa es una nueva manera de imperialismo. Y ahora vemos imperialismo en el planeta también. Emisiones de carbono. 14% de la población reside en países que han significado 85% de las emisiones. Esto también es imperialismo. El conocimiento de tecnologías verdes para lidiar con los cambios climáticos y las catástrofes que ya están tomando lugar. Eso se controla usualmente por el norte y por China. Estas nuevas tecnologías requieren nuevas tecnologías, nuevos recursos. El litio, que es un tema en Latinoamérica, requieren otras tierras raras y elementos raros. El profesor Boaventura habló que Latinoamérica ha sido una fuerza emergente. África lo ha sido por muchos años en el sur, en desarrollo. Y podemos hablar de estas nuevas formas de imperialismo de dos maneras. En primer lugar, crean relaciones domésticas. No es un país contra otro, es básicamente capital grande en contra de todos los demás. A través del patriarcado, a través de las relaciones de clase y a través del control sobre poblaciones indígenas. Recordemos que el tema indígena solo es relevante por el contexto colonialista. Nadie se refiere a los suecos como indígenas porque no tuvieron colonizadores. Digo, hubo inuits que fueron expulsados. Pero, ¿qué significa esto? Que los imperialistas controlan el territorio, la naturaleza y los recursos. La naturaleza del patriarcado es el control sobre las mujeres y la mano de obra de mujeres. Alicia seguramente ya se ha referido a mucho de esto. ¿Qué está pasando ahora? ¿Cuáles son las razones? De nuevo, el profesor Boaventura muy hermosamente habló de lo que estamos viendo ahora, que se está presentando como una guerra entre Rusia y China y estamos viendo estas estrategias geopolíticas a mediano plazo que todas reflejan la lucha por el territorio económico. Pero no jamás pensé que pasaría, que Estados Unidos sería el instigador del declino de la hegemonía del dólar. Pero eso es lo que ha pasado. Estados Unidos con sus sanciones, sobre todo con su apoderación de los bancos centrales de Rusia y los dólares, nos muestran que el dólar estadounidense no se puede confiar. Y esto es interesante porque fueron la guerra en Irak porque Saddam Hussein quería vender petróleo en euros. Estaban dispuestos a ir a la guerra por eso. Y ahora están dañando ellos mismos la hegemonía del dólar. Pensé que el estado profundo, el deep state en Estados Unidos existía, pero estamos viendo el principio del fin de la hegemonía del dólar. Y eso es genial para muchos de nosotros y muchas de nosotras, porque ha habido mucha presión por la hegemonía del dólar, sobre todo para ustedes en el traspatio de Estados Unidos, porque ofrece oportunidades. Está creando otros bloques regionales. Cada vez más bancos centrales han tenido que pensar en otras opciones. No podemos poner todo en oro. Hablando de reservas, tenemos que pensar en otras formas de financiar. No podemos pensar con estas nuevas reglas rígidas del capitalismo. Esta noción del derecho y de las leyes, que si no somos agradables para alguien, nos pueden quitar nuestros derechos, eso está pasando en Venezuela. Y eso nos da más apertura, nos permite pensar en nuevas maneras de establecer relaciones económicas a lo largo de regiones, no solo porque lo quieren las élites, sino porque ya no tienen alternativa. Y desafortunadamente siguen siendo las élites quienes controlan esto. Pero esto también está pasando en un periodo en el que, enfrentémoslo, el capitalismo está moribundo, está muriendo. Algunos argumentarían que está muerto y que simplemente no han movido el cadáver y que simplemente tiene un manto encima. Y esto significaría que solo podemos trabajar con incluso más explotación de varios elementos que he mencionado. Pero eso también significa que hay un empuje de las élites en gran manera, y es importante ver que hay una tendencia similar en el mundo. El empuje de las élites y la resistencia de las élites, no quiero decir que es fascista porque se refiere mucho al siglo XX, pero la oposición de las élites se basa en una ideología que combina el patriarcado con el control elitista de grandes capitales, con clases trabajadoras muy frustradas y que abarcan a diferentes etnias. Y esto está pasando en muchas partes del mundo. Es cierto en India, en todas partes. Brasil es un buen ejemplo. Es cierto, sin lugar a dudas, en Estados Unidos. Estamos viendo esta resistencia de élites, aunque se están abriendo algunos sitios. Y estamos enfrentando también la catástrofe del planeta. El capitalismo, incluso si nos unimos y creamos alternativas, el capitalismo tal vez ya habrá destrozado el planeta. ¿Qué hacemos entonces en este contexto? El profesor Boaventura subrayó el concepto de solidaridad entre gente, entre personas que están tratando de pensar. No quisiera llamarnos intelectuales, no sé qué somos, pero queremos pensar en el mundo y entenderlo. ¿Y qué hacemos? Primero que nada, el primer principio es: hay que resistir la corrupción, hay que resistir la corrupción no solo del Estado y de los capitales grandes, sino de estas indicaciones muy atractivas de pensamiento alternativo que vienen de perspectivas diferentes y perspectivas tradicionales. También tenemos que estar muy al tanto del trabajo importante que se está haciendo en nuestras regiones. Esa es una de las tragedias de las ciencias sociales, que no sabemos las excelentes contribuciones de África, de Asia, en Latinoamérica y en nuestras regiones. Todo se media por el norte global, por esta región. Todos tenemos que estar al tanto de lo que hacemos en nuestras regiones, referenciar ese trabajo y decirle a nuestros estudiantes que lean esos trabajos, porque estamos muy impulsados e impulsadas por las modas intelectuales del norte y ansiamos publicar en esos diarios y en esas publicaciones. Eso es algo muy importante que tenemos que hacer. Y 3, tenemos que diseminar lo más que podamos. Tenemos que crear y aumentar el poder de rendición de cuentas de la gente en tantas personas como podamos, de tantas maneras que podamos, en el medio que sea posible y disponible, medios sociales, etcétera. Les rogaría que aprendan de la derecha sobre esto, porque ellos hacen todo lo posible para diseminar su ideología. Piensen a largo plazo, pero también piensen en utilizar cualquier medio para transmitir este mensaje. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much, dear Hashati. In our panel, we have María Paula Meneses. Buenos días. I'm Maria Paula, and I thank the challenge that my friend Karina instilled in me to talk a little bit about this. I wouldn't talk about transatlantic dialogues because I'm not from the transatlantic region. I'm from the Indian region, and I think that this is one of the challenges that Claxo has said, how to talk from the South that is so diverse and complex. And that is why I agree so much with what my colleagues have mentioned about the complexity of the world. When we talk about the complexity of the world, I was listening to my colleagues, and as yesterday Ventura mentioned that there was an elephant in the room, I think that an elephant of the room is colonialism, because capitalism doesn't exist without colonialism. It's kind of an evil twin that is always present, and we always like to mention that it's history, but it's not. It's the present. I'm going to talk about how I see these problems. In my country, we had an insurgency 2 or 3 years ago, 400 children without schooling, 3,000 elementary school teachers dead, and we had more than 10,000 dead in the past few years. Black people in Africa don't count. When we talk about war, we're talking about a war of white people in Europe, but what is happening in Africa is much more complex than what is happening in Europe. I think that one of the impacts of these imperial power is to silence what is happening in the South, and to try to create a reference which is the interpretation of by the North of the South. Most of the work that we do in our universities are references, are translations, Eurocentric translations of the North Atlantic on the rest of the world. If you check who is speaking about the African continent, and my colleague just mentioned this, about publications, it's basically academics and scholars from the North. Those are the ones who produce the big references to determine the policies of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund for the rest of the world. And we have just hired one more dead with the International Monetary Fund that forces us to get rid of 10,000 school teachers every year. That means that 1 million children can't go to school. That is unhuman. And that is the other side of the colonial capitalism relationship. That is what's happening in the South with these policies, these World Bank policies. So this is why it's important to talk from the South, from our reference sites, our resistance sites, and why it is important to go into academics, fighting and with solidarity, talking from our reference point. What I'm talking about is something that I mentioned in the previous Claxo conference. My country reached independence in 1975. I was born in a colony. I wasn't born outside of it. We were a colony of Portugal. So I saw the end of a colonial and imperial system, the Portuguese system, And the strange thing was that there were clues that pointed to the fall of the system, but we didn't know when it was going to fall. And the strangest thing was that you probably have heard about the Claveiros Revolution in Portugal, the revolution that stopped the dictatorial regime. Before these Claveiros revolution, this carnation revolution, there was a coup. There was a war in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. And that support of these liberation movements that brought democracy in Portugal. That is, the South brought democracy to Portugal. And we've had this conversation before about what the South has given to democracy movements in the North. I think that one of the challenges that epistemology in the South has done, we need to think about, or from other narratives, from other fighting perspectives, and we need to be aware that linear time doesn't exist. We're always outside of the story because we are in development or underdeveloped, and we only see the 7 or 8 developed countries, and they tell us that democracy is always necessary, but democracy, there is no democracy in selecting who is developed or not. And the second thing is abysmal thinking, which is thinking that doesn't allow us to bring our thoughts and ways of thinking in our universities and state to rechange the state. All of us have been born with a colonial heritage, which is the modern state. The modern state, with its laws, is a colonial experiment. We're all in it with different levels of discussion, but there are very interesting things that take place. When we look at the North, we don't see what takes part in the South. For example, in all of our countries, courts don't have a monopoly on justice. But we say, yes, but let's stay modern and implement official justice. But why don't we see amongst ourselves in the South and see that legal plurality is something that characterizes the world, and this is something that would recharacterize the state. It's a project, and it might be very Eurocentric, but we were a Portuguese colony, not a German colony or an imperial Roman colony, and that's why we have laws that instill respect. I think that these things are very important, and the third point, which I think is very interesting, is to think again about what we have achieved in the past and what the present history is always trying for us to forget. In Bandung, there was a meeting, the Bandung meeting, where for the first time colonizing countries were not able to attend. In that meeting, there were two problems: the problem with American imperialism and the strong interference of the Soviet Union in the countries that were emancipating. I think that we need to go back to Bandung. We African countries and Asian countries are trying to say we are not for Russian imperialism or NATO imperialism. We want another thing because we also have our roots, which are different from yours, and that is our project. I think that's very important to think that our universities, which are also a colonial experiment that needs to change, we need to create these dialogues that make us think of other ways of thinking, and sometimes we focus too much on the new, and we think that what is old already existed, but our way of thinking limits us a lot. And this is my last point. We are always teaching in imperial languages. It is important to gain back our languages because our languages are also a way to communicate language. In a country like mine, in which we speak 33 official languages, we might have discussions about what is official and what is domestic, which is similar to the context in Mexico and many Latin American countries. We need to say we also speak reference languages with knowledge, and we need to acknowledge these in universities as a way to widen all discussions about diversity in the world. And this would create knowledge ecology. Very well. Thank you so much, Paola. Our last presenter in this panel is Seteni Shami. Muchas gracias. Gracias, Karina. Gracias, Marta. Gracias a todos los colegas de Claxo por esta invitación. Como última oradora, estoy en una situación en la que me encuentro a menudo. Mucho de lo que quería decir ya lo dijeron, y me encantaría más bien tener un diálogo que presentar mis ideas, pero al mismo tiempo creo que hablo en nombre de la región árabe, que a menudo está ausente en foros transregionales, así que espero que lo que presente subraye las similitudes y diferencias de lo que les interesa a ustedes en el sur global. Una vez más, gracias por invitarme y al Consejo de Ciencias Sociales, Claxo. Yo hablo de la experiencia de la región árabe, que es muy grande y muy diversa, pero también hablo de la experiencia del Consejo Árabe de Ciencias Sociales, que es una organización muy joven. Acabamos de celebrar apenas nuestro 10º aniversario el año pasado, apenas. Entonces, mi interés o mi acercamiento a estos problemas es tanto para el conocimiento que estamos tratando de crear, pero también para los arreglos institucionales y las infraestructuras de conocimiento que necesitamos, que han mencionado algunas de las colegas en el panel. Voy a intitular mi conferencia como Crisis en Ciencias Sociales. Voy a atar las crisis en la región árabe y también las crisis de ciencias sociales en nuestra región, que creo que hemos compartido globalmente, y algunas son particulares a nuestra historia y nuestra genealogía en nuestras ciencias sociales. Quisiera subrayar el cambio en las maneras en que concebimos y practicamos ciencias sociales, las necesidades de hacerlo. Estoy hablando, por supuesto, de la región árabe, como científicos sociales en los entornos que nos rodean. También, no creo que tengo tiempo, pero me interesa mucho discutir aún más el conocimiento y la categorización de sur y norte. En la región árabe siento que estamos entre dos categorías de este y sur, y esto nos pone en una posición muy interesante y en una política interesante de conocimiento. No puedo adentrarme en esto, pero lo llevo pensando bastante tiempo ya. Para la región árabe ha habido dos olas grandes de levantamientos y revoluciones que han transformado verdaderamente a la región, pero no sabemos de qué maneras. la ha cambiado todavía. En 2010, 2011, levantamientos llevaron a cambios de regímenes en Siria y en Egipto, en Siria y en Yemen. En 2015 desajustaron Argelia, Irán y otros países, aunque se contuvieron estos movimientos. Veremos si este contenimiento es temporal o si la pandemia le dio el tiro de gracia a estos movimientos que se estaban desarrollando a finales de 2019. Es importante saber que la región árabe sigue reponiéndose de intervenciones militares. Esto no es el pasado, esto es el presente. Esta región, que contiene 5% de la población del mundo, tiene un porcentaje elevado de los refugiados del mundo. Esto es, por supuesto, personas catalogadas como refugiadas, pero las desplazadas por conflictos internos son muchas más. Estamos en crisis y la crisis ha exacerbado las inegalidades socioeconómicas y ha aumentado la falta de confianza en los gobiernos y ha afectado desproporcionadamente a comunidades marginalizadas. Aparte de los cambios estructurales dentro de los países de la región, hay cambios sin precedente en las dinámicas regionales y transregionales. Nuestras batallas políticas para cada una de nuestras influencias, que generan patrones complejos, añaden una dimensión adicional a las batallas y luchas transregionales por el poder. Pero así como metemos la política, tenemos que meter los flujos comerciales y economías que a menudo ignoramos en estas discusiones, porque los conflictos hacen ignorar las prácticas económicas de las regiones que toman lugar, como mencioné, en comercio, en logística, lo cual es muy importante, en infraestructura y en finanzas. Entonces tenemos que entender mejor uno de los retos como científicos sociales. Tenemos que entender cómo la región árabe está co-constituida con lo global, y cómo lo global y lo regional se ayudan entre sí, cómo se generan diferentes jerarquías e inegalidades en diferentes países. Tenemos que compenetrarnos en los debates políticos tempranos sobre colonialismo, imperialismo y desarrollo. Tenemos que estar compenetrados con estas ideas con la perspectiva del presente. En este contexto complejo tenemos que pensar en las ciencias sociales de las crisis, y también reconocer que las ciencias sociales mismas están en crisis, al menos en nuestra región. Desde la primera ola de levantamientos de 2010 y después en 2019 hemos visto estas crisis en ciencias sociales en las calles. Por un lado, tenemos un caso que se hace para defender a las ciencias sociales en las calles, porque los levantamientos y las protestas exigen un nuevo entendimiento del pasado y el presente, y una nueva visión para el futuro, que es uno de los pilares de las ciencias sociales. Y por otra parte, el rechazo de todos los órdenes y todas las hegemonías también significa el rechazo de las formas tradicionales de conocimiento. En otoño de 2019 en Beirut, cuando los levantamientos acumularon a 1,5 millones de personas en las calles, en un país de 4 millones de gente, hubo debates sobre la ley, el derecho, la constitución, el medio ambiente, las mujeres, los derechos sexuales, migrantes y sus derechos. y una variedad de temas. Y al mismo tiempo hubo un rechazo de los expertos, de la academia tradicional y de la modalidad de la lección o la conferencia académica. Todos ustedes en estos foros, en este entorno académico, hubieran sido retados y retadas por la modalidad misma, no por lo que decían. Y a menudo este rechazo de estas modalidades de academia tradicional fueron articuladas por académicos mismos, lo cual se relaciona con lo que escuchamos antes sobre los cambios en el aprendizaje y en el conocimiento. Así que las estructuras centenarias de pedagogía y ciencias sociales no pueden atender actualmente las necesidades de los tiempos o las necesidades de la comunidad de investigadores o las necesidades de la gente que se está organizando para lograr un cambio. Como muchas otras regiones en el sur, las ciencias sociales han estado en desventaja por mucho tiempo en universidades. Las universidades públicas están en declive, los miedos públicos están fragmentados, hay muy poca oportunidad de circulación, hay mucha competencia. Y es por eso que me agrada que Claxo conjunte a tanta gente, porque los académicos a veces pueden estar limitados. Y esto se refiere a la producción de conocimiento en la región y a la producción de conocimiento. Estos problemas que enfrenta la academia y las ciencias sociales ya los conocemos, pero hay nuevos retos actualmente que podemos llamar el reto de la urgencia y la temporalidad. Las tragedias en todos los niveles de la sociedad son impulsos morales, escolares y sentimentales que nos llaman a estar presentes en lo que trabajamos y a encontrar soluciones. Esto está justificado en mi opinión, pero ¿qué significa para la temporalidad tradicional de la producción de conocimiento, que requiere tiempo para discusión, debate, desacuerdo, síntesis, etcétera? Cuando hay una demanda pública tan fuerte para atender a problemas inmediatos, creo que esto es un reto epistémico para las ciencias sociales, y esto forma parte de lo que quisiera sugerir para las crisis. Hemos tenido una tendencia, al menos en nuestra región, de pensar en las crisis como atemporales, como si tuvieran un principio y un fin, y no tanto como un contexto continuo que moldea nuestras experiencias personales y nuestras prácticas académicas. Así que sugeriría que todas las estructuras académicas y pedagógicas en la región desarrolladas en el colonialismo se cuestionen y se encuentren como inadecuadas para atender las modalidades en las que se debe de producir el conocimiento. Tenemos que pensar en los departamentos de conocimiento, en los intercambios, en las conferencias y su formato, los salones de clase. Todo esto se tiene que retar y se está retando, y están saliendo alternativas, pero en espacios intersticiales, fuera de las estructuras formales y las instituciones formales, en universidades callejeras, en grupos de debate informales, en colectivos artísticos, etcétera. Esto está usualmente fuera de las instituciones formales de nuestro país, y a pesar de las críticas de los estados y las élites políticas que se han restringido en los últimos años, es muy difícil tener visas de los países de la región, y es muy difícil de tener convenciones en la región sin permisos especiales por el control y el intento de controlar las discusiones y las convenciones y las reuniones. Sí vemos instituciones naciendo en estos espacios intersticiales que están cambiando las discusiones, las jerarquías y sobre todo la estructura patriarcal de las cosas. Quisiera terminar con algunos pensamientos que son más bien preguntas. No tengo muchos ejemplos, pero no tengo modelos para proponer. Lo que están haciendo estos cambios, primero que nada, como lo mencioné, es que están cambiando las jerarquías de producción de conocimiento a través de la creación de nuevas sociedades a lo largo de disciplinas, sectores, artistas e investigadores, activistas cívicos trabajando en conjunto. También teorizando desde las calles. Esta energía para teorizar viene de las calles y están creando nuevas conexiones de conocimiento que se tienen que pensar. El rol de los investigadores transregionales y la diáspora de investigadores se amplifica en este nuevo contexto. Esto facilita nuevas circulaciones y participaciones. Esperamos que esto esté moldeando una nueva generación de investigadores e investigadoras que van a necesitar programas de intercambio y de apoyo para cumplir el potencial en estas nuevas maneras de producir conocimiento. Y por último, algo que estamos pensando mucho en la región árabe es cómo trabajar con las crisis y el conflicto y cómo investigar conflicto y crisis manteniendo la ética, las libertades y estos aspectos de la investigación que son importantes, incluso cuando las circunstancias hacen que sea difícil hacerlo. Quisiera dejarlos con la idea de la solidaridad que se ha mencionado anteriormente y que encuentro una idea central para que nuestro trabajo se mueva hacia adelante en nuestra región. Hay muchas maneras de solidaridad y, como el profesor Bonaventura mencionó, hay instituciones y los investigadores e investigadoras están abriendo las puertas a conectarse de otras maneras y al salvaguardar espacios de conocimiento, y estas solidaridades son importantes, pero como se mencionó también, hay solidaridad al citarnos unas a otras, al encontrar inspiración unas con otras. Tenemos que encontrar maneras para que podamos hacer esta solidaridad epistemológica. Entonces, me voy a detener aquí. Muchísimas gracias. Hay mucho más que podría decir. Thank you very much. This was such an exciting panel. We will now have 15 minutes for Q&A and for discussion in this auditorium. So please, if you have a question, please wait for a microphone. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you. Good morning. I am Andrea Kenia Sanchez Cepeda. I'm a social worker here at UNAM. Good morning, everyone. I would like to share a reflection to the panel in relation to our colleague from UNAM. I am part of the Claxo group for Southern epistemologies, and we had a class recently with Professor Boa, and I was thinking also that I come from the south of professions. UNAM is very beautiful and everything, but we know that there's a tremendous verticality. We know that there are voices that are invisibilized because we're not social sciences. But we are, however, there, and part of our methodology is to be with collectives, with social movements. And I was listening to our colleague, the professor, and she was talking about economic stability, and I was wondering what economic stability in Mexico from 2009 to 2019, at least in social, in the social dimension, that was the most destructive time against the social fabric because of the war against drug dealers and crime. So this dialogue is great, but I would love to have transdisciplinary dialogues within this university because we need to democratize student life. The students have demanded this before, and between professors there is a lot of verticality, and this is something that I would like to bounce off of you, colleague. Good morning, I'm Larissa. And I would like to ask a question to Setani. I'm going to ask it in Spanish. You mentioned solidarity in your last point, and I was wondering how we can weave solidarity between our spaces, especially knowing that we can try to have epistemic solidarity. We know that there are colleagues that are imprisoned in Palestine, despite the fact that they are academics. I would like to know what you think about the boycott against Israel. Is this a valid strategy, and how can we sustain this from universities in the global south? I had a situation in which while a friend was in prison, there was a visiting teacher from Tel Aviv, and so I was wondering how we can weave solidarity with that. Good morning, Alim Punjab. I am Roxana Villegas. I am a Bolivian Quechua indigenous person, and I would like to talk about some ideas that I started thinking because of what you mentioned. I personally don't think in the dialogue between the North and South. I believe in the South-South dialogue, and this dialogue in the epistemological level, in the practical level, and in the methodological level. We continue to prove our ancestral knowledge with which we have lived for so many years. They keep sustaining us, yet we continue to do investigations with the scientific method. So I would pray to maybe reflect a little bit about that. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Good morning, I'm Luis Sembrano, and I work in epistemology. How solidarity and how some consciousness work at the neural level. In the panel, it caught my attention the speech about solidarity, but as our colleague mentioned, how would a South-South dialogue work? How would a change work if we see this type of activity, South-South dialogue. Good morning, I am Anilu from Colombia. And about the 5 myths of economy, and listening to Professor Boaventura and the topic of solidarity, in all economics faculties, we all continue to teach the same thing. I did my doctorate in Brazil, I did another course in Italy, and all faculties replicate the same model. Despite the fact that we see that it has failed astronomically, and professors don't have tools to figure out what else to teach. When you receive these programs, you might wonder about using popular workshops, but universities limit you as a professor. And ministries also tell you what you need to teach. I, who graduated from one of the universities in Colombia, I myself have been relegated by my own colleagues to be an economist that deals with social issues, feminism, etc. But I look for little windows. One of the proposals from Professor Boaventura is the proposal of popular workshops and how our students can open these little windows, because without a doubt, the economic system failed. It failed, and COVID was simply an example of how it will continue to fail before any other crisis, small or big. But faculties of economy need to continue to teach the students and prepare them for these future crises. What do we teach them? Maybe hand in hand with what we teach them, we should teach them something else. We're not going to reconstruct everything from scratch. No. Economic growth and Milton Friedman, and we're not going to say, let's get rid of that. That's a lie. No faculty is going to allow us. How, however, can we start deconstructing knowledge and teach economics with a social science area or a finance area centered in economic knowledge and human being as an axis? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I don't know if we have room for one more question. Is there anyone else? Well, let's hear Rosa and then the other colleague. Good morning. I salute you from Latin Africa, or Africa Latina. Salutations to my professor and my colleague, my sister, Ana Paula and Karina. I think that we need to see what happened here as an opportunity from the epistemic point of view and the politic point of view. I think that the panel hasn't just landed a diagnosis in some spaces, but it has also set some challenges. Let me just mention these challenges once again. The first challenge: the South is less and less geographical. It's political. While looking at the South, we need to look not just to the South, but also to the North. That is harvesting a very violent South. Let's not forget our sisters who are hurt in the largest capitalist countries in the world. That is something that we need to have in our discourse. I apologize for always standing, but as an Afro-feminist, when I denounce something, I need to stand. We are not just the victims, but we are also the alternative. Second, I wanted to talk about a concept that is very important, the concept of, as Silvia mentioned, they come and we can't admit the skepticism and uncertainty that others want to instill in us. There is another road. We need to move forward, and this is a process that is ongoing. I share our route as a process. We need to move forward with political resistance, visualization. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Rosa Campo Alegre Septien, head of the Claxo work group on Afro-descendancy and the African diaspora, who is going to be presenting together with Miranda, great intellectuals, great feminists in this afternoon. So we invite you to listen to them. I also want to welcome Kasinjik, who's going to be participating in this afternoon as well. I think that we have one last question, maybe, from the colleague in the back. Hello, good afternoon. Hello. It's very difficult to speak after the professor, but I have a question for all panel members. I'm from Colombia, but I'm doing my PhD in York University in Canada. And there's a problem that we're having, I think, which is the neoliberalism in social sciences. We can see this in the United States, for example, the topic of critical theory that is being analyzed and censored. How can we put this on the table from the social sciences of the Global South? And also the Global South is becoming a bit more diffused. And if we go to North America, the United States has a lot of influence in academics and scholars and academics being developed in Canada, for example. How can we translate the idea I think that geographical studies have done a lot of work in solidarity, and how can we use these sort of concepts in what we call transatlantic dialogues? Thank you very much. Would you like to share your comments as you presented? Shall we begin with Professor Boaventura, or do we invite in verum? So Professor Boaventura is going to be last. We're going to start with Seteni. Muchas gracias por todas estas preguntas. Yo diría simplemente que la colaboración sur-sur y la solidaridad sur-sur no es simple. Es fácil tal vez sentarnos aquí y estar de acuerdo en general, pero cuando comenzamos a trabajar juntas, nos damos cuenta de que hay muchas cosas que tenemos que aprender entre nosotras, que tenemos que aprender de las prácticas de otras discusiones y conferencias, desde la organización, desde organizaciones hasta lo intelectual. Hay muchas cosas que desconocemos. de las partes, y la colaboración es importante, tenemos que mantenerla viva, pero necesita, en relación a su pregunta, Larisa, necesita tal vez comenzar más pequeño, hacer comunidades dentro de una comunidad más grande, comunidades que funcionen bien entre sí, que discutan metodologías y pensamientos, porque hay muchas diferencias conforme más cavamos. Creo que el trabajo ya ha comenzado con Claxo, es muy importante, pero no es suficiente, al menos no en lo que se refiere a lo que ha estado disponible para nosotras. Y también todas tenemos que estar activas y buscar este diálogo sur-sur y estas formas de trabajar en conjunto sur-sur. Hay diferencias de idioma, de genealogía, de ciencias sociales, y especialmente hablando de Palestina, el movimiento BDS. El movimiento BDS a menudo se personifica, en Estados Unidos al menos, como un movimiento político superficial, y es un conjunto de lineamientos muy matizado, muy bien estudiado, que las instituciones y las personas pueden adoptar y pueden adoptar en parte, rechazar en parte, pero no es un movimiento de rechazo, es orgánico, es palestino, es concienzudo y es la respuesta a situaciones que cambian. Así que la información está allá afuera, las instituciones y los individuos pueden decidir. Para mí es importante que los palestinos y palestinas mismas lideren esto y no solo un grupo homogéneo. Hay opiniones divergentes y creo que debemos de compenetrarnos seriamente con ellos y no solo rechazarlos o tildar algo de antisemítico. Así que muchas gracias por esa pregunta. Y lo único que puedo decir en términos de cómo construir solidaridades es que diría que comencemos pequeño, íntimo, personal, para entonces crecer. Los foros más grandes están disponibles para nosotras, pero también tenemos que trabajar en los detalles más pequeños y más íntimos. Thank you very much, Setani. We continue with Maria Paula. Thank you. I'm going to be very quick because I have to leave. Marisa's going to kill me. 3 or 4 things. I think that the first question is that the South is not geographical. It's political, it's ontological, it's epistemological. It exists with a long history. It was first called the Third World. Pan-Africanism, Pan-Asianism. It has had many names, but we have added things, but we need to know that history, and I think that that is very important. We also need to know that imperial senses have changed a lot as well. I was thinking, for example, about my country, that unfortunately, we have natural resources such as gas and coal, and those interested is Norway, Singapore, India, Brazil, China, Australia. It's not the United States directly, and we need to understand that imperialists are much more complex, and to look at the United States and Europe alone doesn't allow us to understand the complexity of how the geographical South has many imperialist movements and moments in it. I think that that is fundamental, to know which side we're on, with whom, because otherwise we go with everyone and there's no coherence in our fighting. The second thing about the scientific method, my problem with the scientific method is that just as with many other things in sciences, is not a product of science. Science is a way of producing knowledge from the 17th century. I don't know if you still have grandparents or family members who are farmers or agricultural workers, but all farmers do experiments with seeds. If I mix this with that, I'll get this. It's not that they stole ideas from science, it was the other way around. I think that science is an important way to build knowledge, but at times science takes ways of creating knowledge from other areas, and the knowledge is the process as scientific. And I think that that is a complaint from us that is very important. We are here because there are computer language that allows us to have simultaneous interpretation, but computer language, as you know, is just zeros and one. 1, 2, 3, 4 are not European numbers, they are Arabic numbers. We have numbers in the Incan societies, the Arabia and Mesopotamia, and we can download knowledge in computers from the world. If we don't know things, we will continue to repeat these problems. I have a lot of respect for current Peru because it will give in the 17th century the seed of a tree that is going to fight against malaria. And of course, you know all the information about Peru and information from India and Portugal. And what is the beginning is these plants from Peru that fought against malaria. So we need to have a more horizontal gathering of knowledge and about imperialism as a way to impose regulations and normativities, and the creation of knowledge in other ways in a very clean way or sterile way, and especially about solidarity. It is not possible to be in the world without solidarity. If there was no solidarity, my country would not be independent, because we had solidarity between North and South, between the South and the South, and it allowed us to have weapons that came from Algeria or Egypt, etc., or the support from Cuba in the training of doctors and nurses. We fought because people were with us. I'm going to quote Milton Gibral. We need to be in the fighting, in agreement with the fighting, because it helps us know the fighting. I think that what happens often is that we don't know in depth. What we're all taught in this university is very restricted. We are taught a very small part of knowledge. I think that a challenge is to say we are ignorant, we need to know more, let's look for knowledge in other places. For example, the social movement university was mentioned, to try to learn more, because knowledge is created in dialogues, not just in offices. If we are human, we need to speak. That's my final comment. Thank you. Thank you for these interesting questions. Thank you so much, Maria Paula. And now Hashati. Muchísimas gracias por estas preguntas tan estimulantes. Ni siquiera voy a tratar de contestar todas. Solo quisiera dejarlas como una nota positiva sobre este diálogo y solidaridad sur-sur, que sí es difícil y hay cada vez más limitantes para lograrlo. Sobre esto, bueno, una muy buena pregunta sobre cómo se nos fuerza a enseñar lo mismo en materia económica. Y bueno, es demasiado importante esta disciplina, por eso está tan controlada, por eso se busca las instituciones y los marcos que controlan la economía están muy orientados hacia la preservación de un tipo específico de epistemología y hay guardianes muy firmes de esto. Por eso tenemos estos diarios en los sitios considerados como buenos en la escala, en la jerarquía. Sé que muchos teóricos económicos han sido empujados a departamentos de ciencias sociales. Es cierto. Por eso la economía se tiene que resistir desde sí misma y por eso el alcance amplio es tan crucial. Ya hemos discutido varias ideas y cómo el alcance de los principios económicos va mucho más allá de lo académico. Los economistas están lamentablemente al servicio del poder muy a menudo y al poder de capitales grandes y por lo mismo todas las instituciones que gobiernan hacen esto. Pero ¿cómo lo combatimos? Verdaderamente quisiera cerrar con una nota positiva porque yo me enfoco en las últimas generaciones y en qué tanto han empujado para lograr cambios posibles. Hay creo muchas iniciativas en economía, no sé si en Latinoamérica, en muchos países tenemos la iniciativa de académicos jóvenes que son creaciones de gente joven, muy activa, muy entusiasta, muy buena. Nos dan conocimiento muy interesante y debido a la tecnología pueden trabajar en conjunto en diferentes regiones, lo cual encuentro extremadamente optimista. No encuentro nada pesimista en el diálogo sur-sur, al contrario, mucho de nuestro trabajo ha terminado siendo muy en línea por lo que ha pasado y esto ha permitido interacciones que antes no eran posibles y hay mucha gente motivada, veo mucha gente motivada que puede trabajar en conjunto y pueden producir conocimiento en conjunto y hablar del trabajo de otros y otras y diseminar el trabajo de otros académicos y estudiantes y pueden tratar de hacer investigaciones muy interesantes de muchas maneras. Así que personalmente soy más optimista del potencial de la solidaridad sur-sur. Thank you very much, Hayati. Alicia, please. Well, thank you very much for these two questions that are so triggering. I think that there's a problem with economic sciences. That's why I wanted to start and put on the table the myth of economics. Indeed, the economics that is taught around the world is the neoclassical economics. And all tax and financial policies that have been ongoing for the past 40 years have taken us to a crisis in social reproduction. And therefore, I think that it's very interesting and it's very important to move to the heterodoxical economics that go from the Marxist to the future. There are different alternative ways of thinking and currents that don't focus on maintaining countries stable. When I mentioned stability was because before the Washington Council, etc., the political and economic stability of 2009 to 2019, what it did was to disrupt social fabric. And that is why we have two kinds of economics. One that we see with numbers and an underground one, which is macroeconomics, that is more and more powerful. And we need to say this constantly. And this other economics is not seen by people in the World Bank or in other instances and agencies that could help. I would like to mention that in the Economic Research Institute and in the economics postgraduate program, a network that you can found, we taught 2 courses on contemporary economics, and there we talk about economics completely differently from what is taught in economic schools. We also have the Ola Financiera magazine, Financial Wave, with a series of articles that without a doubt will give you mainly a critique of the neoclassical economics. And on the other hand, something that is very important is the work that social workers do, men and women social workers, because they protect life. I don't know why people don't consider this a science, because it has a lot of science in it. Social work is highly important, and we need to start from there to have a national care system. Why do we have a national care system, at least in Mexico? Well, the National Women's Institute is working on this. I have been invited to this group where the United Nations participates and many other international agencies participate. The problem is that there's no money. As long as we pour limitless amounts of resources to our foreign debt, and this is the case for Mexico and Latin America, especially now with all of the debt that was contracted to face COVID, well, without a doubt, it won't be possible to move ahead. Investment in care, and that is why feminists and feminist economists maybe one of the biggest gifts to economic science has been how non-paid work is part of our daily life and how it has to be part of our political life. We can continue speaking more and more about this. I hope I answered the questions. Professor Boaventura, I think that we have a lot of difficulties while building bridges, and I'm more concerned about this because even if we're on the same side of the fighting against colonialism, against capitalism and the patriarchy, we tend to criticize more rather than share alternatives. Critical thinking doesn't have motivational movements, really. That is why movements have become old recently. Solidarity is not possible without an epistemological revolution, because the concept of individual that we have is the concept of individual that breaks bridges. Individuals thinking of their own interests, and now individualism wants young people to be business people with themselves. What does that mean? Am I a self-slave? I'm a self-slave, and I have the right to not have rights. It's not possible to have that. It's necessary to have cognitive justice, without which there is no social justice, and that is why we need to have epistemology in the center I speak in different universities, and I'm not going to speak about a specific one, but universities are so important in the global south, and the more important they are, more jealous they are of northern universities. Indeed, the south is not geographical, it's epistemic. Universities, the oldest ones, the farthest from the center, the peripheral ones are the ones that have the most innovation. But what is the problem then? You in your schools must do this exercise. One by one, you need to see how you can propose an alternative to what you're learning. To know is to set objectives or subjects. In the North, they create objects, not subjects. To be objective, is that to be neutral, or can I be objective without being neutral? The Northern science says that to be objective, you need to be socially neutral and politically neutral. In our society, to be neutral is to be with the power is. Third, in your department, are only scientific knowledge considered valuable knowledge? Is your medical school willing to attract traditional doctors to teach students a little bit about what most Mexicans have access to? Those so-called alternative medicines? Or law departments, do they invite common law and indigenous law judges on top of inviting traditional judges? Let's see where that leads. 4, what is our concept of time? Progress. Linear time is opposed to agricultural time, stars and planetary movements. What is more important, universality or being global, or the local scale? As the feminists have taught us, my body is my land. There's a grain war in Ukraine, and indigenous in Brazil are suffering because it's necessary to mine more for the agro-fertilizers in the industry, and because nothing is coming from Russia and Ukraine, it needs to be brought from indigenous peoples. Does your department allow this or not? And what is it to be productive? A capitalist production cycle or an agricultural and farmer cycle, feminist, popular, urban of these towns? Is it that? Why do we teach only capitalist production cycles? You, as professors and students, need to ask these questions to your university departments and build your epistemology, because if you don't have that, you won't be able to have solidarity. You will only have a hierarchy solidarity and not a collective learning process. I think that this is a historic work that we obviously need to be strong in our complaints, but also let's please think of the improvements. You can't imagine the inertia that allows dead ideas to continue to be the dominating ideas in our departments. Why do dead ideas have so much power? Ask that. This is collective work that is necessary. Organize yourselves, teachers and professors and students, because this is not easy to neutralize. Organize yourselves with the strategy of an epistemic insurgency. It is possible to apply other types of knowledge through transdisciplinary efforts. not interdisciplinary efforts, but transdisciplinary efforts with other knowledges that are not scientific. I see some students of mine in the PhD program, and they know the risk that they are under when they try to create epistemology in the South. But that is the risk that we need to suffer, always with the idea that new articulations are possible. I'm with my colleague from India, and we should always focus on collaboration, and I always think of well-being, all of the resources that come from the Caribbean and all around the world. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Boaventura. If we may, we would like to read this poem, The Creole Garden. According to a European interpretation, the tree represents genealogy. It's actually called genealogical tree. And the tree is all of the roots and the trunk. After that comes the branches, generation after generation. And so the tree is the one thing that excludes everything else. Myself and others think that this point of view is not useful for all. If I had to draw a tree, I wouldn't draw a tree. I would draw a jungle, an entire forest. Thank you very much.